Hi, Grandma here, and I'm reading Mr. Lincoln's Drummer, Chapter 6. In Chapter 5, Willie and the Vermont Regiment have started their march to Richmond. It's not going very fast, though, and they had to fight off a gunboat coming down a river that was torpedoing them. I guess maybe cannons. I don't think they had torpedoes back then. The 3rd Vermont broke camp on the next morning and headed west again. On to Richmond, we yelled, but it didn't seem as though we were getting very far along. Each march was worse than the one before, and I came close to cursing. Between the heat and the mud and the miserable rain, Virginia was taking on the look of a God-forsaken land. The narrow roads led some men to straggle. Regiments spread over miles, and the trailing company sometimes took hours to catch up. Along the way, dozens of slaves flocked to our lines, hoping for protection from their former owners. The year before at Fort Monroe, a rebel officer had appeared under a flag of truce and demanded the return of a runaway slave. General Ben Butler, the fort's commander, had refused. Soon, hundreds of slaves were escaping. Some politicians and many generals wanted the slaves sent back, but General Butler had insisted the slaves were contraband, just like cotton or gunpowder. They could be used to aid the rebel cause, too, and he kept them at the fort. Some Massachusetts regiments backed General Butler with their muskets, and later on President Lincoln himself stopped the return of the runaway slaves. We Thirders were an abolitionist lot from an abolitionist state, and we helped the slaves whenever we could. Some, like the women at James River, refused to leave their plantations. Scores of others poured into our lines, choking the roads and halting our advance. Most of those slaves came with little more than clothes on their backs. They had no food, inadequate clothing, and no shelter. We distributed what spare blankets and extra food we had, but it was not enough. Slaves kept coming, and we had to shake our heads sadly and pass on by. I was especially touched by the look of the little children. One morning, our entire company gave up its breakfast ration to a crowd of children. Most of them were no bigger than my brother Charlie, and it tore at my insides to see them hungry, dressed in rags, and staring stone-faced at the sky. Not one of them, or their mothers or fathers, would ask for a thing. "You boys go on fighting," one white-haired old man urged. "You chastise them others." I had always pictured slaves as big, strong men picking cotton, but seeing all ages and sizes turned me bitter toward the rebels. I bit my lip and quickened my step. The 3rd eventually spread out opposite the rebel works near Yorktown. The town itself looked out on the York River, but we only got near the river once. Cal organized a bunch of us into a foraging party, and we collected some oysters in the tidal pool. The rest of the time, we dug earthworks, paraded out of range of the rebel guns, and waited for a chance to fight. "This army has a strange notion of campaigning," Lando complained the night our equipment finally caught up with us. "We rush halfway around Virginia so we can surprise the Rebs, and then we sit here waiting." We all felt that way. As I helped erect our tents on soggy Virginia ground, I gazed around at my companions. We were mud-splattered and generally weary. Our hair and clothes were full of lice, and mosquitoes attacked us hourly. Every day, a new man took sick, and the regiment was gradually melting away. We all wished General McClellan would go ahead and attack. Instead, he ordered our scouts, sent observation balloons up into the air to look over the Reb defenses, and called the other generals to conferences. The only hint of war was the occasional firing off of a few cannons. Our guns pounded a stretch of the rebel lines, and they shot back later. It was the worst kind of luck to get hit by one of those cannonballs. The gunners were not aiming at anyone in particular, and they caused no real damage. Most times, the company nearest our artillery would pass the word up and down the line whenever the gunners went to work, and we would cower in our waterlogged trench or hide behind one of the quartermaster wagons. Captain Harrington had us up and digging and drilling every morning it wasn't raining, but he mostly let us alone in the afternoons. Some of the men used the time to hunt hogs that escaped from the neighboring farms. At first, the men shot the porkers with their shiny new Springfield rifled muskets, but Colonel Hyde put a stop to that when the Rebs began firing cannons in response to what they imagined was an attack. "Any objection to our hunting with bayonets?" Cal asked. The colonel just smiled, and the hunting soon resumed. I saw hogs speared with bayonets, shot with handmade bows and arrows, and even trapped in pits. "I don't suppose it matters how long the hog meets its end," the rest observed. "The meat tastes the same." I hope they don't wait too long. I had no rifle myself, not even a bayonet, so I was a little use as a hunter. I aided my companions in another way, though. All along the Yorktown line, little streams or ravines separated the lines. One afternoon, as I was out gathering kindling for the cook fire on our side of the stream, I felt a tap on my shoulder. I turned and saw a young Reb soldier pointing a pistol in my face and jumped a foot in the air. "Oh, don't get yourself all stirred up," he urged. It was the first time I'd come face to face with the enemy, and I stood there wide-eyed, unable to move. "You won't go yelling or nothing, will ya?" he asked. I managed to shake my head, and he stuffed the pistol in his belt. "I come to trade," he added. "I got some good tobacco. Swap it for coffee." He shook his head at me and began laughing. "First time anybody ever took fright from seeing me," he confessed, taking off his cap. He had enormous ears that stood out each side of his freckled face. "Name's Jeb, short for Jabez Davis. Now don't go mistaking me for our illustrious president, who's not even a close cousin." The president of the Confederacy was Jefferson Davis. And so he's saying, don't confuse me, Jabez Davis, with Jefferson Davis. But the president of the United States, of course, was Abraham Lincoln. "Oh, I wouldn't," I assured him. His smile and those immense ears simply overpowered my fear, and I managed to regain my senses. It was pretty hard to be afraid of Jeb. He looked a little older than me, but not much. He wasn't as tall. The tattered legs of his brown trousers stopped an inch shy of his bare feet, and what passed for a tunic had 6 or 7 patches on the right sleeve alone. "Ain't much to look at, am I?" he asked. "Not much," I agreed, "but then I'm not so much myself." "You'd be a drummer, being small as you are," Jeb observed. "Yanks don't allow youngsters on the fighting line. I drummed myself, but come Christmas when I turned 14, the captain promised me a musket." "Oh, I'm not 12 yet," I told him. "I don't have much use for tobacco, but I'll pass on word of your offer. We could probably sacrifice some coffee." "You decide to swap, come back tomorrow morning. I'll be nearby," he suggested. "You won't go pointing that pistol at me next time, with you?" "Naw, I don't shoot friends," he assured me. "What's your name, anyhow?" "Willie," I told him. "Willie Johnston from Vermont." "Oh, I'm a Georgian myself," Jeb explained. "You keep your head down, Willie, and don't tell no officers. They frown on such doings." I nodded. I glanced a moment back toward our lines, and Jeb vanished like a puff of smoke. I shrugged my shoulders, collected some sticks, and headed back to camp. My tent mates were overjoyed to learn of Jeb's offer, and I swapped a pound of coffee for several twists of tobacco the next morning. Jeb handed me a list of wants. I returned to camp and began scrounging. With a little help from my teammates, I came up with 5 blankets, 3 links of cloth, 7 razors, 12 pairs of shoes, and 2 more pounds of coffee. "The Reb wants just about everything but powder and lead," Russ noted. "I don't suppose we'd want to trade that," I said. "Oh, that'll come later," Lando said, frowning, when the fighting gets going. Meanwhile, I don't favor swapping a man the lead he can mold into a bullet that can kill me. We all agreed. In truth, Jeb and his company were far more interested in coffee, razors, shoes, and cloth. Already, the South was running short. Virginia was full of tobacco, though, and cut off from markets. The Army of the Potomac, over 100,000 strong now, had eaten just about every pea and carrot between Hampton Roads and Yorktown, so vegetables carried a high value on our side of the stream. I got plenty of tobacco, several fine smoking pipes, and every kind of vegetable available on the Virginia Peninsula. I hoped things would remain quiet along the line because I wanted my visits with Jeb to continue. The trading died down after the first day, but I went back to the stream the next day, even though I had nothing but soap and a little salt to trade, and I enjoyed sharing time with somebody close to my age. We talked quite a while. Then someone tossed a rock into the stream, and Jeb grew solemn at that signal. "Can't stay any longer," he declared. "Don't you come back either, Willie. Your officers started sending out pickets, and the sentries were jittery, liable to shoot anybody." "I guess a battle's coming." "Ain't had one in a time, Willie. Suppose it was bound to be. You watch out, you hear?" "You too," I replied. "You make a big target with those ears of yours." "Most everything else of mine runs to the small side," he said, laughing as he gazed down at his toes. "I wouldn't even much care if they shot an inch or so off my ear. I wouldn't favor losing a leg, though. My brother Billy gave one up at Manassas." "Sorry," I said, frowning. "Oh, no matter," Jeb muttered. "You got your fight to make, and I got mine." There was a new hardness in his eyes, though, and I found myself staring at the pistol in his belt. It didn't seem possible that somebody could be both a friend and an enemy at the same time. But there we were, face to face, Yank and Reb. As I turned to leave, I heard him slither into the brush and disappear. When I returned to camp, Russ ran over and grabbed my elbow. "Willie, Lieutenant Buck's been asking after you," he whispered. "Get on up to the captain, something's happening." I had sensed it the moment I left Jeb. I located my drum, slipped the sash over my shoulder, and hurried to the captain's tent. Jace Wheeler, pale as death, was leaning on a stack of crates beside the flap. "Johnston, get inside," the little fifer urged. "You sick?" I asked. "Inside," he muttered, before the captain starts yelling again. I stepped inside, met Captain Harrington's frowning eyes, and froze. "Willie, hurry up your firewood gathering hereafter," Lieutenant Buck said, fighting back a grin. "Doesn't do to have our drummer long absent from camp." "No, it doesn't," Captain Harrington declared. "I want you to beat assembly in 5 minutes, boy. Meanwhile, dress yourself properly. I won't have the company going into battle look like a band of ragged rebels." "Battle?" I gasped. "Yes," he barked. "You've kept Wheeler waiting 10 minutes already. He almost had to call assembly with that fool fife of his. Children. I wish I had a few grown men in this command." I thought to point out that Wheeler was better than 20 years old, but it's not wise to pour oil on a smoldering fire. The captain had always been somewhat nervous, and he was pacing around his tent like a man who had sat down on a hornet's nest. I dashed outside, hurried to my tent, and began throwing on my uniform. "What is it, Willie?" Cal asked. "We going someplace?" Blackie asked. "Battle," I told them. "I'm beating assembly as soon as I can find my canteen." "Lord Almighty," Cal said, scrambling around in a frantic effort to locate his cartridge box. "Lord Almighty!" "Johnston!" Sergeant Courier howled. "Johnston!" I slung my canteen over my shoulder, buttoned up my pants, and fastened my 2 top tunic buttons. "I'm here, Will," I said, as I dragged myself out of the tent. "Button yourself," he scolded, "and don't address me by my Christian name." "Sorry, Sergeant," I said, staring at my toes. "Well, don't stand there like a schoolboy caught with a frog in his pocket," the sergeant said, grinning slightly. "See if you can finish dressing and get up to the color line before the rest of us are old and gray. Call assembly." Yes, Sergeant, I replied. I did as ordered and hurried to my station. Captain Harrington and Lieutenant Buck were already there. The captain was fidgeting, slapping his gloves against his knee and babbling to himself. Lieutenant Buck appeared calm. He nodded to me and I took my station, pulled on my sticks and bear assembly. Seconds later, I heard Julian Scott's fife. Company E was assembling as well. Across the way, F and K stood to arms. There was a rare urgency in the air, and the men quit their usual grumbling and formed lines. Some trotted over in their shirts, but Lieutenant Buck and the sergeants hurried them back to their tents. In short order, the whole company, or at least that part of it that wasn't sick, lined up and awaited orders. Boys, Captain Harrington finally said, we have the honor of leading the regiment into action. Hurrah! Sergeant Courier shouted. The others added a faint echo. General Smith himself is waiting for us, Lieutenant Buck added. Here we have been at war close to a year, and somebody's finally seen the sense of putting us into action. Shall we disappoint the general? No, we roared. Captain, Lieutenant Buck asked. Captain Harrington took his cue. He formed the men into columns, and we began marching. Wheeler and I stood at the head of the company, beating a steady pace. My sticks pounded the drum, and my feet sloshed along the muddy roads. The captain had slipped back down the file, but Lieutenant Buck remained nearby. That's it, Willie, he told me. Keep the pace steady. You're doing just fine, son, just fine. I tried to smile. I tried to swell up with the kind of, too many pages, pride I had back in St. J, beating the drum as the captain called for volunteers. I felt the eyes of the whole regiment on my back, though, and I remembered what the officers had told me 1,000 times. A drum is the heartbeat of the Army. Mostly, though, I found myself thinking about Jeb and his crippled brother. I tried to muster the rage I'd felt when we had fed the slave children our breakfast. I couldn't do it. Instead, I glanced sideways toward Company B camp, hoping Pa might be assembling too. His company was marching off to the right, though, and I had no chance to see him. I was off to battle, alone, with only Wheeler and his fife for company. I was nervous and practically scared to death. What a crazy notion it was, joining the Army, going to war. I shook off the image of St. J, of Ma and James and Charlie. Instead, I concentrated on the slope just ahead and the swampy ground that lay beyond. Lord, help us, I prayed as we continued onward. Lord, help us. Well, this sounds like they're getting serious. I hope the battle is successful and that not many of Willie's friends or family get injured. We'll see in the next chapter, maybe. Bye-bye.